The universe, as it turned out, had a rather twisted sense of humor. Here was Nexus Prime, a space station the size of a small moon, bristling with enough firepower to glass a continent, and housing the most advanced civilizations known to exist. Yet somehow, the beings running this cosmic circus had collectively decided that humans were about as threatening as a soggy sandwich. Commander Iris Blackwood stood at the observation deck of Docking Bay 7, watching alien dignitaries scurry about their important business like ants with superiority complexes. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd been assigned the smallest quarters, the worst parking spot, and a diplomatic aide who spoke in clicks and squeaks that roughly translated to "sorry your species is pathetic." Nexus Prime served as the galactic community's crown jewel, a neutral ground where the three dominant powers of the Triumvirate alliance conducted their affairs with all the grace and subtlety of a supernova. The station orbited a binary star system, its crystalline spires and rotating habitation rings catching the light in ways that would have been breathtaking if Iris hadn't been too busy being insulted by the architecture. Even the buildings here seemed designed to make visitors feel small. The Vorthak had built the military sectors. Naturally, these insectoid warriors stood 8 feet tall on their good days, with carapaces that could deflect small arms fire and mandibles that could snap a human neck without breaking conversation. Their philosophy was elegantly simple. If it moved and wasn't Vorthak, it probably needed killing. They'd conquered half the galaxy before the other two species had politely suggested they try diplomacy instead. The Vorthak had agreed, mostly because war was expensive and they'd discovered that threatening people was almost as satisfying as actually disintegrating them. The Zalani controlled the intelligence and communications networks, which was fitting since they were living energy beings who could read minds like grocery lists. They existed as shifting patterns of light and consciousness, housed in crystalline containment suits that hummed with barely contained power. To them, biological species were quaint curiosities, like watching bacteria through a microscope. They found human emotions particularly amusing, the way a child might giggle at a puppy chasing its own tail. Then there were the Kreks, the galaxy's self-appointed technology custodians. These aquatic beings had evolved in the crushing depths of their homeworld's oceans, developing brains that processed information at quantum speeds. They traveled in environmental suits filled with specialized fluid, looking like walking fish tanks with delusions of grandeur. The Kreks had a habit of calculating the probability of success for everything, including conversations, and they'd apparently determined that humans rank somewhere between statistical anomaly and rounding error. Together, these three species had carved up the galaxy into neat little zones of influence, maintaining peace through a delicate balance of mutual assured destruction and bureaucratic paperwork. It was a system that worked beautifully, provided you ignored the small matter of dozens of younger species being treated like cosmic house pets. Humans, according to the prevailing wisdom, were the galaxy's charity case. No natural weapons, no telepathic abilities, no advanced technology that hadn't been borrowed or stolen from someone else. Earth's greatest contribution to galactic civilization was apparently really good coffee, and an inexplicable talent for creating entertainment that made other species feel better about their own problems. Iris checked her chronometer and sighed. The emergency session would begin in 30 minutes, and she already knew how it would go. The Triumvirate would discuss the problem with all the urgency of a tea party, propose solutions that involved massive expenditures of everyone else's resources, and graciously allow humanity to provide moral support from a safe distance. It was the same dance they'd performed for the last decade, just with different choreography. The crisis du jour involved something that had been systematically dismantling outer rim colonies with the efficiency of a cosmic lawnmower. 12 systems had gone dark in the past month, their final transmissions cut off mid-sentence. The attacks followed no discernible pattern, struck without warning, and left nothing behind but empty space where thriving worlds once orbited their stars. The Triumvirate was, to put it mildly, concerned. What made this particular crisis special was its democratic approach to destruction. The mystery attackers didn't discriminate based on species, technology level, or diplomatic alignment. Vorthak military outposts vanished, just as completely as Zalani research stations or Kreks manufacturing hubs. It was the kind of equal opportunity annihilation that made everyone nervous, which was why they'd called this emergency session in the first place. Iris made her way through the station's corridors, noting how other beings instinctively moved aside. Not out of respect, mind you, but rather the way one might step around a lost tourist who clearly didn't belong in the neighborhood. The Vorthak clicked their mandibles in what might have been amusement or disdain. With insects, it was hard to tell. The Zolani's containment suits flickered with colors that her translator helpfully identified as patronizing sympathy. Even the maintenance drones seemed to hover just a bit higher when she passed, as if her species' reputation for technological incompetence might somehow be contagious. The council chamber was a masterpiece of architectural intimidation, designed to make visitors feel appropriately insignificant. The ceiling soared several hundred feet overhead, supported by columns that had been carved from single pieces of exotic crystal. The seating arrangement formed concentric circles, with the Triumvirate's representatives occupying the center ring and everyone else relegated to increasingly distant orbits based on their perceived importance. Iris found her assigned seat in what could charitably be called the spectator section. It was located behind a pillar next to the waste disposal unit, and apparently came with a view of absolutely nothing important. The symbolism was about as subtle as a brick through a window. General Thrix Ka of the Vorthak military caste dominated the central platform like a monument to controlled violence. His carapace bore the scars of 100 battles, and his four eyes constantly tracked potential threats with the paranoia of someone who'd survived by never trusting anything that moved. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately and without question. "The threat continues to advance," Thrix Ka announced, his mandibles clicking with barely suppressed aggression. "Our scouts report complete sterilization of targeted systems. No survivors, no wreckage, no trace of the attackers themselves. This enemy employs technology beyond current understanding." Mindweaver Luxon materialized beside him, her energy form pulsing with the serene confidence of someone who could read everyone else's thoughts like headlines. The crystalline framework containing her consciousness hummed with harmonic frequencies that made nearby electronics nervous. When she communicated, the words appeared directly in listeners' minds, accompanied by emotional undertones that conveyed far more than mere language. The psychic echoes from these attacks are disturbing. Luxon's mental voice carried overtones of genuine concern. Whatever is responsible operates with a coldness that defies conventional consciousness patterns. It feels almost mechanical in its precision, yet demonstrates strategic thinking beyond artificial intelligence parameters. Tech Arch Blub 7 completed the Triumvirate, his environmental suit gurgling with whatever passed for contemplative thought among his species. The Krex leader's multiple arms worked constantly at holographic displays, calculating probabilities and running simulations with the obsessive dedication of someone who trusted mathematics more than intuition. "Probability matrices indicate escalating threat parameters," Blub 7 announced, his translated voice carrying the flat certainty of a computer reading specifications. "Current trajectory suggests major population centers will be targeted within 47 standard days. Recommended response: immediate evacuation of vulnerable systems and consolidation of defensive resources around core worlds." The chamber filled with the multilingual equivalent of nervous murmuring as lesser species processed this information. Representatives from dozens of worlds shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly aware that their civilizations might be next on someone's extermination list. Thrix Ka's attention turned to the outer rings, his predator's gaze settling on Iris with the casual interest of someone examining an unusual insect. "The human representative is present, I see. How fortunate. Perhaps Earth's diplomatic corps has insights into this crisis." The question dripped with just enough politeness to avoid being technically insulting while making it clear that any human contribution would be welcomed with all the enthusiasm reserved for unsolicited advice from small children. Around the chamber, various beings turned to look at Iris with expressions ranging from mild curiosity to outright amusement. Iris stood slowly, taking her time to survey the assembled representatives. The gesture might have seemed respectful if not for the way her eyes catalogued every face, every defensive posture, every tell that suggested her audience had already decided she was wasting their time. "Commander Blackwood, Earth Defense Force," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic design. "I've reviewed the available data on these attacks, and I believe there may be a solution that hasn't been fully explored." Luxon's form pulsed with what the translation matrix identified as polite skepticism. "Please, share your species' perspective." We value diverse viewpoints, however limited they might be by technological constraints. The phrase landed like a velvet-wrapped insult, delivered with a kind of diplomatic precision that made it impossible to take offense without appearing unreasonable. Around the chamber, other representatives exchanged glances that suggested they were settling in for an entertaining display of human naivety. "I'd like to request 72 hours to coordinate with Earth Command," Iris said, ignoring the subtle condescension. "My government has been developing certain contingency protocols that might prove relevant to this situation." Blub 7's environmental suit gurgled with what might have been laughter. Probability of human technological solutions exceeding Triumvirate capabilities, approximately 0.0003%. Margin of error accounts for statistical anomalies and measurement precision limitations. Nevertheless, Thrix Ka interjected, his mandibles clicking with magnanimous patience, "We shall extend this courtesy to our human allies. 72 hours should provide adequate time for Earth to contribute what resources it can to the relief effort." The phrasing made it clear that nobody expected much beyond moral support, and perhaps some of that excellent coffee humanity was known for. Iris nodded her acknowledgement, noting how quickly the conversation moved on to more serious matters, like fleet deployments and evacuation schedules. As the session continued, she activated her personal communicator and established a quantum-encrypted link to Earth Command. The connection took several minutes to establish, routing through relay stations and security protocols that the Triumvirate would have found quaint if they'd known about them. "Admiral Chen here," came the response from Earth, the signal carrying just enough distortion to remind Iris that she was very far from home. "I take it our galactic neighbors are experiencing some difficulty." "That's putting it mildly," Iris replied, keeping her voice low. "Unknown enemy, complete system sterilization, advancing toward core worlds. The Triumvirate is planning evacuation and defensive consolidation. Standard doctrine, basically. And they are expecting us to provide what, exactly? Moral support and coffee." Iris allowed herself a small smile. Admiral Chen had spent enough time dealing with alien bureaucracy to understand the dynamics at play. Something like that. "I've bought us 72 hours to offer an alternative approach." Project Pandora. Project Pandora. There was a pause while Chen consulted whatever classified files contained the details of humanity's most carefully guarded secret. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone about to authorize something that would either save civilization or get them all court-martialed. "You have operational authority, Commander. I'll begin deployment immediately. Try not to start a war with our allies in the process." "No promises, sir." The connection terminated, leaving Iris alone with her thoughts and the continuing drone of alien politicians discussing logistics with all the urgency of a university committee planning next year's budget. She settled back in her uncomfortable chair and waited, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether humanity remained the galaxy's favorite pet project or finally earned the respect that came with being genuinely dangerous. 48 hours later, the enemy struck again. The target was Luxon's homeworld system, 3 planets orbiting a blue giant star that had been the center of Zolani's civilization for millennia. The attack came without warning, just like all the others, but this time the Triumvirate was ready. 3 separate fleets had been positioned around the system, representing the combined military might of the galaxy's 3 dominant powers. The battle lasted exactly 17 minutes. Iris watched the tactical displays from Nexus Prime's command center, surrounded by increasingly panicked alien officials who were discovering that superior numbers meant very little when your enemy treated physics like a polite suggestion. The mysterious attackers had arrived in ships that defied conventional design, moving with impossible acceleration and shrugging off weapons that should have reduced them to component atoms. The Vorthak fleet attacked first, naturally. Their doctrine favored overwhelming firepower applied with surgical precision, and they had enough battleships to glass a small moon. The enemy ships absorbed the barrage without visible damage, then responded with weapons that simply deleted Vorthak vessels from existence. One moment a kilometer-long dreadnought was firing full broadsides. The next there was empty space where it had been. The Zolani tried a more sophisticated approach, using their telepathic abilities to coordinate attacks, while simultaneously attempting to establish mental contact with the enemy. The results were about as effective as trying to negotiate with a hurricane. The mysterious ships continued their systematic destruction, showing no more awareness of Zalani mental probes than a computer virus might notice attempts at rational discourse. The Krek's fleet lasted longest, mainly because they spent the first 10 minutes of the battle running probability calculations instead of actually fighting. When they finally engaged, their precision targeting systems and quantum torpedo salvos proved marginally more effective than their allies' efforts, which was to say they managed to scratch the enemy's paint before being vaporized in return. As the last Triumvirate ships disappeared from the tactical display, an uncomfortable silence settled over the command center. The enemy fleet had lost exactly 0 vessels, while eliminating the 3 most powerful military forces in known space. The implications were too large to process all at once, like trying to understand infinity by counting to 10. Probability of successful resistance with current resources, Blub 7 announced in his flat, mechanical voice, has decreased to 0.0001%. It was at this moment that Commander Iris Blackwood chose to make her entrance, accompanied by what could charitably be described as the most pathetic fleet deployment in Galactic history. 12 ships, each roughly the size of a Triumvirate escort vessel, appeared at the edge of the system with all the dramatic impact of a paper airplane at an air show. "What?" General Thrix Ka demanded, his mandibles clicking with barely controlled fury. "Does your species imagine those toys will accomplish where our fleets have failed?" Iris studied the tactical display with the calm interest of someone reviewing a shopping list. The enemy ships were already moving toward Luxon's homeworld, their intentions as clear as their capabilities were mysterious. In approximately 30 minutes, 3 billion Zalani would cease to exist, adding another system to the growing list of sterilized worlds. "Those toys," Iris said conversationally, "are going to solve your problem." The statement was delivered with such casual confidence that it took several seconds for the assembled aliens to process what they'd heard. When they did, the response was about what one might expect from beings who'd just watched their finest military assets get swatted like insects. "Human arrogance appears to scale proportionally with the magnitude of their delusions," Luxon observed, her energy form flickering with what the translation matrix hesitantly identified as homicidal irritation. "Commander," Thrix Ka said with the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a slow child, "perhaps you failed to observe the preceding engagement. The enemy has demonstrated technological superiority that renders conventional weapons ineffective. Your dozen museum pieces will be destroyed in seconds." Iris activated her communication system, establishing contact with the lead ship of her small fleet. "Captain Morrison, you're cleared for Operation Pandora. Try not to embarrass the species." "Copy that, Commander. Beginning approach now." The human ships moved toward the enemy fleet with all the speed and grace of freight haulers, which wasn't entirely inaccurate, since that's exactly what several of them had been before their recent conversion to military service. They were ugly, primitive, and cobbled together from components that the Triumvirate had discarded as obsolete decades ago. Watching them approach the sleek enemy vessels was like watching a pack of wolves square off against fighter jets. "This is suicide," Thrix Ka declared. "I cannot permit this waste of sentient life, however misguided. Recall your ships immediately." "Negative," Iris replied, her attention focused on the tactical display. "We've got this." What happened next would be discussed in military academies for centuries, though the official reports would need significant editing to remove the more colorful language used by eyewitnesses. The enemy ships detected the approaching human fleet and responded with the same decisive force that had eliminated the Triumvirate's finest warships. Beams of exotic energy launched out across space, striking the lead human vessel with enough power to vaporize a small asteroid. The ship absorbed the hit, shook it off like a dog shedding water, and kept coming. "Impossible," Blub 7 announced, his environmental suit gurgling with the aquatic equivalent of a system crash. "Energy displacement patterns indicate complete absorption without structural damage. This violates known physics." More enemy weapons opened fire, concentrating their full attention on what should have been an insignificant human fleet. The primitive Earthships continued their approach, their hulls glowing with absorbed energy that was being channeled into systems that the Triumvirate sensors couldn't even identify. "What are they doing?" Luxon demanded, her mental voice carrying overtones of frustrated confusion. Iris allowed herself a satisfied smile. Something you never thought to try. They are using the enemy's own weapons against them. The human ships had closed to point-blank range now, and their true purpose became apparent. Instead of exotic energy weapons or quantum torpedoes, they opened fire with projectiles that belonged in a museum, chemically propelled kinetic rounds, electromagnetic railguns, and fusion-powered missiles that any civilized species had abandoned centuries ago. The enemy ships, designed to deflect or absorb energy weapons, had no defense against simple chunks of metal traveling at significant fractions of the speed of light. Their exotic shielding might as well have been tissue paper against weapons that worked by the simple principle of hitting things really, really hard. Primitive kinetic weapons, Thrix Ka said in the tone of someone experiencing a religious revelation. They're using primitive kinetic weapons. Gets better, Iris said, watching as human boarding parties began cutting their way into disabled enemy vessels. The attackers aren't alive, by the way. They are AI constructs, probably rogue military hardware from some extinct civilization. Very advanced, very sophisticated, and completely helpless against good old-fashioned computer viruses. The truth was almost elegant in its simplicity. The mysterious enemy had been using stolen technology from multiple sources, creating a patchwork fleet of vessels that had absorbed the best defensive systems from every species they'd encountered. They could deflect Vorthak plasma cannons, ignore Zalani psionic attacks, and adapt to Krex quantum weapons with ease. What they couldn't handle was being boarded by humans carrying shotguns and laptop computers loaded with malware that had been specifically designed to exploit the kind of integrated systems that any advanced AI would naturally develop. The attackers had spent so much time adapting to sophisticated threats that they'd never considered the possibility of someone showing up with a crowbar and a basic understanding of computer programming. Captain Morrison's voice crackled over the communication system. Command ship secured, Commander. Shutting down their entire network now. Across the tactical display, enemy vessels began going dark as their controlling intelligence was systematically dismantled by weapons that predated interstellar travel. Ships that had seemed invincible minutes before now drifted helplessly in space, their advanced technology reduced to expensive debris by viruses that could have been written by a talented high school student. The silence in Nexus Prime's command center was profound, broken only by the gentle hum of life support systems and the distant sound of Blub 7's environmental suit processing this new information. It was the kind of quiet that usually preceded either profound enlightenment or complete nervous breakdown. Total human casualties. Thrix Ka finally asked, his voice carefully neutral. None, sir, Morrison reported. A few bumps and bruises from the boarding action, but nothing serious. Enemy fleet is completely neutralized. General Thrix Ka stared at the tactical display for a long moment, his four eyes tracking the positions of disabled enemy vessels that his own fleet had been unable to scratch. When he finally spoke, his mandibles clicked with what might have been respect or simply bewilderment. Commander Blackwood, he said carefully, it appears your species possesses certain capabilities that were not adequately represented in our intelligence assessments. Iris nodded gravely, maintaining the poker face that had served her well through decades of military service. We prefer to think of ourselves as problem solvers, General. It's amazing what you can accomplish when nobody expects you to succeed. Luxon's energy form pulsed with colors that the translation matrix was having difficulty interpreting. The tactical implications are significant. If human military doctrine can neutralize threats that overwhelm conventional forces, then maybe, Iris suggested gently, it's time to reconsider some of your assumptions about which species in this galaxy are actually helpless. The weeks following what historians would eventually call the Battle of Zalani, Prime saw some interesting changes in galactic diplomatic protocol. The Triumvirate's previously ironclad control over major policy decisions became somewhat more collaborative, particularly when dealing with issues that might require unconventional solutions. Humanity's status evolved from cherished pet to valued consultant with remarkable speed. Iris found herself assigned to much better quarters on Nexus Prime, complete with a view of something other than waste disposal units and structural support beams. Her diplomatic aide had been replaced with someone who spoke actual words instead of clicks and squeaks, and who had been instructed to treat human communications as significantly more important than they had been previously. The real change, though, was in the way other species looked at humans now. The condescending amusement had been replaced by something that might have been wariness, or possibly respect. It was hard to tell the difference sometimes, but either one was a substantial improvement over being patted on the head like a clever pet. "You know," Admiral Chen said during the next scheduled communication, "I'm getting reports that Vorthak military academies are adding courses on primitive warfare techniques to their curriculum. Apparently, they are quite impressed with the tactical applications of hitting things with sticks." Iris laughed, watching alien diplomats hurry through the corridors outside her window with what appeared to be actual purpose. "Just wait until they discover what we can do with pointy sticks. That should really blow their minds." The irony, she reflected, was that humanity had never actually been helpless. They'd simply been operating under a different set of assumptions than the rest of the galaxy, assumptions that turned out to be surprisingly effective when applied with sufficient creativity and stubbornness. The Triumvirate had built their entire civilization around the idea that more advanced was necessarily better, that evolution meant leaving primitive solutions behind in favor of elegant sophistication. It had never occurred to them that sometimes the best way to solve a complex problem was to ignore the complexity entirely and hit it with something simple until it stopped being a problem. Humans, on the other hand, had never quite managed to abandon their primitive heritage entirely. They developed advanced technology, certainly, but they kept the older stuff around too, just in case it might prove useful someday. It was the kind of pack rat mentality that more sophisticated species found quaint and slightly embarrassing. Until, of course, that embarrassing primitive heritage saved the galaxy from extinction and made the sophisticated species realize they might have been missing something important all along. The universe, as Iris had noted at the beginning, had a rather twisted sense of humor. It took particular delight in teaching important lessons to beings who thought they were too advanced to learn anything new, especially when those lessons came from the species they'd been calling helpless. She supposed there was a certain cosmic justice in that, though she was professionally obligated to be gracious about their victory. After all, humanity needed these alliances to work, and nobody benefited from rubbing their former underestimation in their faces too vigorously. But privately, in the quiet moments between diplomatic meetings and strategic planning sessions, Commander Iris Blackwood allowed herself to enjoy the satisfaction of a job well done and a reputation thoroughly demolished. They'd called her species helpless, after all. She'd crushed their doubt in a single blow.